As many have come to discover in recent years, there are great forces at play which are attempting to use a controlled demolition of the world financial system in order to justify a new age of global governance. This would be a post-nation-state age where supranational entities representing an oligarchical elite will dictate every move made, every word spoken. We would become their new depopulated slave class, who will be expected to adapt to a world of scarcity. We will own nothing and be happy and have no connection to our own history or traditional values. The Hungarian mega-speculator turned philanthropist turned color revolutionary George Soros is a common representation of such forces, often identified by the political right, who have clearly recognized his tentacles shaping everything from Antifa to BLM, critical race theory reforms in education, liberal reforms across legal systems, and even election fraud. While Soros is readily accused of being a nefarious influence, ideologically committed to destroying the traditional values that once animated our democratic West, the danger he represents is often assumed to be superseded by only one other force of even greater evil: the Communist Party of China. While one may harbor great concerns over China's growing presence on the world stage, it is a little-known fact that China was the first nation to successfully identify and purge Soros's evil over 30 years ago. While other countries were busy letting Soros's armada of open society foundations infiltrate them at every level, China, after experiencing the full impact of a Soros operation, was forced to deal decisively with the sociopathic billionaire. Soros is willing to enact regime change either the hard way or the soft way. The hard way has involved bombing nations to the Stone Age, as seen in the cases of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, all of whom were destroyed due to the fallacious intelligence concocted by George Soros's International Crisis Group, founded in 1995 alongside Lord Mark Malloch Brown. The soft way is commonly referred to as a color revolution, such as the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003, the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, the Orange Revolution of 2004, and the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. Countries that have experienced a Soros-funded color revolution face such consequences as complete regime change, with the installation of an American puppet regime, subjugation to the International Monetary Fund, debt slavery, cessation of national development, and privatization of public services. The Soros regime change method came home to roost in America in 2020, with destabilizing BLM riots throughout the summer, leading to Dominion voting machine disruptions of a likely Trump victory in November. Dominion Voting Systems is a Canadian company which has shared office space with Soros's Tides Foundation and dominates the USA's private computerized voting systems, servicing 30 states and 70 million voters. It is closely tied to another larger company called Smartmatic, whose operating systems and even software it absorbed during Obama's administration. Dominion Voting Systems is highly enmeshed in the Clinton Global Initiative, Soros's Open Society, and Nancy Pelosi herself through her husband's role as leading investor in the organization. It should be noted that the chair of Smartmatic was none other than Soros's color revolutionary colleague, Lord Mark Malloch Brown. Lord Malloch Brown has worked closely with Soros over the course of 40 years as the head of Soros's Quantum Management, president of Open Society, co-founder of the International Crisis Group, vice president of the World Bank, and Undersecretary General of the United Nations, where he was instrumental in promoting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 21, and humanitarian interventionism in the form of responsibility to protect into UN foreign policy doctrine in 2005. From its launch in 1979, Soros's Open Society Foundation was designed to work hand-in-hand with a new set of Anglo-American intelligence agencies run by the Trilateral Commission of David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, which took control of the U.S. government during the 1970s. This nest was devoted to systems of world government, depopulation, and empire, and dominated the presidencies of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. By 1975, the CIA's dirty hand funding coups, assassinations, and regime change operations, both within America and abroad, had become too well known as media coverage of their dirty operations spoiled the patriotic image which the intelligence community then desired. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 had shed light on many of the abuses of the CIA, which brought such dark operations as Project Mockingbird, MK-Ultra, and COINTELPRO into public consciousness. It was that same year that a 12-person Congressional Investigative Committee on Assassinations led by Congressman Richard Schweiker demonstrated that the CIA was involved in the murder of not only John F. Kennedy, but also Fred Hampton and Martin Luther King Jr. While the world was told that the CIA reformed itself upon these public revelations, the reality is that a vast rebranding took place under the veneer of private agencies and NGOs which would now carry out the CIA's dirty work. What became Project Democracy herein originated with a Trilateral Commission meeting in May 31, 1975 in Kyoto, Japan, as a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski named Samuel Huntington delivered the results of his task force on the governability of democracies. This project was supervised by former CIA Director James Schlesinger and presented the notion that democracies could not function adequately in the crisis conditions which the Trilateral Commission was preparing to impose onto America and the world through a process dubbed the controlled disintegration of society. The Huntington Report stated, quote, "One might consider means of securing support and resources from foundations, business corporations, labor unions, political parties, civic associations, and where possible and appropriate, governmental agencies for the creation of an institute for the strengthening of democratic institutions." It took 4 years for this blueprint to become reality. In 1979, 3 Trilateral Commission members named William Brock, Republican National Chairman, Charles Mannett, Democratic National Chairman, and George Agri, head of Freedom House, established an organization called the American Political Foundation, which attempted to fulfill the objectives laid out by Huntington in 1975. The American Political Foundation was used to set up a program using federal funds called the Democracy Program, which issued an interim report, The Commitment to Democracy, which said,
"No theme requires more sustained attention in our time than the necessity for strengthening the future chances of democratic societies in a world that remains predominantly unfree or partially fettered by repressive governments. There has never been a comprehensive structure for a non-governmental effort through which the resources of America's pluralistic constituencies could be mobilized effectively."
In May 1981, Henry Kissinger, who had replaced Brzezinski as head of the Trilateral Commission and had many operatives planted around President Reagan, gave a speech at Britain's Chatham House, the controlling hand behind the Council on Foreign Relations, where he described his work as Secretary of State, saying that the British
became a participant in internal American deliberations, to a degree probably never practiced between sovereign nations. In my White House incarnation then, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department. It was symptomatic.
By November 1983, the National Endowment for Democracy Act was passed, bringing this new covert organization into reality, with $31 million of funding under 4 subsidiary organizations: AFL-CIO, Free Trade Union Institute, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Center for International Private Enterprise, the International Republican Institute, and the International Democratic Institute. Without an appreciation for this multi-headed hydra that overthrew dozens of nationalist governments under the cover of human rights during the ensuing decades, then no proper comprehension of history or ability to understand the role of George Soros would be possible. George Soros had begun to make a name for himself as a conscience-free economic hitman as early as World War II, collaborating with Nazis, which he described as the best time of my life.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right.
Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all. No problem at all.
No feeling of guilt?
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish, and here I am watching these people go, I could just as easily be there, I should be there. None of that.
Well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow.
Followed by a mentorship under the Fabian Society's Karl Popper at the London School of Economics, where he acquired his idea of open societies as a cover for world government control. Edmund de Rothschild agent George Karlweiss, chairman of the Rothschild Swiss-based bank Privy, endowed Soros with the financial resources needed to launch a new type of organization called a hedge fund. From this moment onward, the young speculator began to make a fortune as a financial mercenary released during the new age of deregulation and deployed to destroy the economies of any nation resisting a banker's dictatorship through currency speculation. Using his ill-begotten resources, George Soros was assigned to set up a network of private organizations to advance democracy building around the world. In 1979, Soros's Open Society Foundation came online and began to interface closely with the National Endowment for Democracy that soon set up 2 offices in China in the 1980s. David Ignatius, the former head of the National Endowment for Democracy, admitted in 1991 that this organization was little more than a front for the CIA when he noted that, quote,
"A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA."
Throughout the 1980s, the stage was set for the New World Order, which some had come to call the end of history. In Hungary, George Soros's Open Society Foundations infused restructuring, privatization, and other market-driven reforms in 1988, which saw a new oligarchical class beholden to Wall Street emerge onto the scene. In the Philippines, Soros's partner in crime, Mark Malek Brown, and the CIA organized mass propaganda and election manipulation to oust the nationalist leadership of Ferdinand Marcos and install a Western tool named Corazon Aquino in an early color revolution called the People Power Revolution. Russia had warmly embraced Soros and the National Endowment for Democracy under the leadership of liberalizer Mikhail Gorbachev, who ensured that the stage would be set for the submission of Russia to a new age of destruction that would come to be called perestroika. During the 1990s, this program was titled Operation Hammer by the Trilateral Commission's George Bush Sr., and this program of looting of former state enterprises under the watch of the International Monetary Fund took the name shock therapy. Although it is not well known today, China nearly met this fate during the 1980s as George Soros enjoyed vast control over China's economy and even found a loyal Chinese devotee in the figure of Zhao Jiang, who soon came to be known as China's Gorbachev. Zhao had become premier of China from 1980 to 1987, and from 1987 to 1989 rose to the highest position of authority as chairman of the Communist Party of China. In 1986, Zhao sponsored the first of two new Soros-run think tanks with the Fund for the Reform and Opening Up of China, using a $1 million grant by Soros, followed by the Institute for Economic and Structural Reform, co-run by Zhao's close advisor Chen Yizi. Zhao also ensured that thousands of young Chinese were given scholarships to receive indoctrination into Milton Friedman's ideology within Western universities, where they were expected to return to oversee China's inevitable perestroika as a new technocratic managerial class. All that was needed was a revolutionary shock to break the hold of China's nationalists and force Zhao Jiang into a Pinochet-like position of dictator and privatizer who would force his nation into the IMF clutches. It was here that the CIA's James Lilly, ambassador to China, the National Endowment for Democracy, and George Soros deployed all of their resources to activate a full-blown color revolution on June 4, 1989, with student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square bursting into violence. What began as peaceful protests were soon infused with violent provocateurs, and efforts at peaceful dialogue were sabotaged by thousands of Molotov cocktails and dozens of unarmed Chinese soldiers who were hanged and lit on fire. Needless to say, unlike the cases of Hungary, the Philippines, or Russia, this coup d'etat failed to achieve its goals. In the wake of this attempt at a color revolution, China's leadership immediately removed Zhao Jiang from power, placed him under house arrest for life, and arrested his leading cohorts. China also lost no time shutting down Soros's Open Society foundations and banned the financial terrorist for life. With the vast assistance of Hong Kong triads, the CIA and MI6 arranged Operation Yellowbird, which funneled these Western provocateurs and Soros assets out of China, where many received luxurious rewards and scholarships at Ivy League universities in the USA, forming what the Washington Post's Gavin Hewitt described as the nucleus of a democracy movement in exile. Despite how one might feel about the communist regime in China, the benefits to the Chinese people since ending Soros's meddling speak for themselves. Instead of imposing scarcity and poverty onto their people, the post-Soros China has witnessed the greatest leaps of progress and abundance over the past 20 years, with a middle class that made up only 3% of the population in 2000, now making up over 53% in 2022. Even average longevity, which was once led by the USA, has been overtaken by China, which has lifted the average life expectancy from 44 years in 1963 to 77.5 years today, standing in stark contrast to the USA, whose average life expectancy fell to only 76.1 years of age as of September 2022. Meanwhile, in the West, where Soros's ideology and control of government and information have only grown exponentially since the 1970s, we see a very different result. Where the USA once pioneered infrastructure development and railways, 60 years of stagnation under the control of the Trilateral Commission's death cult has reduced transportation grids to tatters, while China has built up over 42,000 kilometers of high-speed rail and has built 5 of the 10 largest hydroelectric dams in the world. While the US was induced to destroy its nuclear and space sectors, China has become a global leader in nuclear power infrastructure, building nearly 50% of all nuclear power stations in the world, and will soon be the only nation to manage a space station, which will be part of a broader lunar colonization and mining mission with Russia. Donald Trump is many things to many people, but unlike George Soros, Sir Henry Kissinger, or Lord Mark Malloch Brown, a British intelligence asset is not one of them. Upon President Trump's surprise victory in 2016, a new American paradigm of foreign policy was unveiled that had not been seen in over 50 years. Upon his electoral victory, Trump went to war with Soros's Open Society Operations and National Endowment for Democracy front groups internationally by slashing the NED budget by 2/3 in 2018. On August 14, 2018, Trump tweeted to Americans that China is not our problem. The problem is with the Fed. Trump also broke America free of NAFTA, which Kissinger had earlier described as, quote, the greatest step towards the New World Order, by giving nations the right to use protectionism and direct their own credit for the first time in 25 years. And he committed to liberate the USA from participation in the World Health Organization, even announcing halting all funding to the organization in 2020. It was also no secret that Trump saw Russia as an ally, forcing the U.S. military to cooperate with Russia in Syria against ISIS, and called repeatedly for creating good relations with Putin and Xi Jinping. Standing in opposition to the deep state agents infesting his administration, Trump announced the terms of his international outlook in April 2019, standing alongside Chinese Vice Premier Liu He, saying,
between Russia, China, and us, we're all making hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons, including nuclear, which is ridiculous. I think it's much better if we all got together and didn't make these weapons. Those three countries can come together and spend on things that are more productive toward long-term peace.
This obviously shocked the deep state, who were still angry over Russia's 2015 decision to follow China's lead in shutting down National Endowment for Democracy operations and kicking out George Soros, with the foreign ministry calling them, quote, a threat to the foundations of Russia's constitutional order and national security. This call for a U.S.-Russia-China cooperative policy ran in tandem with the first phase of the U.S.-China trade deal, which went into effect in January 2020, guaranteeing $200 billion of U.S. finished goods purchased by China. Had this not been sabotage, then Trump's efforts to rebuild the destroyed machine tool sectors of Detroit, Philadelphia, and America's agro-industrial sector would have been possible. None other than Soros himself suffered a public meltdown that month when he announced at the January 2020 Davos summit that the two greatest threats to his open society were 1. Trump's USA, and 2. Xi Jinping's China. Describing his view that the USA must oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative instead of finding points of collaboration, Soros stated,
regrettably, President Trump seems to be following a different course, make concessions to China and declare victory while renewing his attacks on U.S. allies. This is liable to undermine the U.S. policy objective of curbing China's abuse and excesses.
Soros had already publicly called for the overthrow of Xi Jinping in 2019, so this renewed hate for Donald Trump's plans should not come as a surprise. Despite the global psychological warfare operation launched in the form of a global pandemic in 2020, Trump worked hard to avoid falling into the Soros trap of sabotaging the last best hope he had to reconstruct U.S. manufacturing, avoid World War III, and establish an anti-globalist alliance behind U.S.-Russia-China partnership. On January 20th, 2020, when pressed to attack Xi Jinping as an enemy, Trump stated,
he's for China, I'm for the U.S., but other than that, we love each other. Our relationship with China right now has probably never been better. We went through a very rough patch, but it's never, ever been better. My relationship with President Xi is an extraordinary one.
Soros's victorious color revolution in the USA itself, which occurred as part of a grand collusion between big tech, social media operators, and the same deep state that oversaw John F. Kennedy's murder 60 years earlier, annihilated this momentum towards cooperation and war avoidance. China and Russia have been made to appear as shadowy global supervillains devoted to destroy the free and democratic rules-based order. Those countless conservative voices clamoring for the downfall of Presidents Putin or Xi Jinping would do well to reevaluate their positions when they find themselves promoting the same stated goals as George Soros. Although liberal and conservative media outlets, which include alternative media, have convinced most citizens living in the collapsing West that Russia and China are our enemies, is it possible that the Project Mockingbird CIA operations that took control of all media outlets during the Cold War are still firmly in control of the narrative shaping our worldview? Is it possible that this Anglo-American oligarchy which oversaw the murder of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and which worked so hard to destroy Russia and China and the USA over decades, now wants to turn an abused and frightened Western population into fear-driven cheerleaders clamoring for a US-led war with China and her allies? So the next time you find yourself entertaining the notion that China is the cause of your problems, take a step back and ask yourself why Soros isn't allowed into their country, even though he is running yours.